Is it a culture? Is it a system of value? Is it this huge constellation of contradictions? Would it be this shining star, or would it be this black hole sucking into it the whole world? Can we afford it? Just like Professor Stefan had said yesterday. So we are not here to bring questions, to bring answers. We are here to know, put the real questions. I don't expect that we come out from this course having real answers to all what's in our mind. But what we need, what we are looking for to learn from our professors is to know how to put questions about China, how to understand the fabric of the Chinese mentality, of the Chinese society, and understand a bit of history and bit of the structure. Thank you very much. I'm not staying too much here on this podium. I would be definitely honored to have our professors beginning. I think it's Professor James. You have the CVs for everybody. I don't need to repeat or to take time of your time in introducing our very much prestigious and respectful guest. Thank you very much. So we may need you to put this, yes? Just
right.
You can put it here or here.
I want to know how to do this. I've
No,
done it many times.
just put it here. Yeah.
Can I go on my belt?
Yeah, that's all fits.
It
Yeah,
can't.
yeah, it's good. Yeah. Let me help you. Yes, that's good. Yes, that's good.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samir. And can I just begin, and I know I speak for my colleagues as well as myself, in thanking Dr. Samir, Sarah, and all colleagues from the Orient Institute for this invitation to come and join you this week. It's a very exciting opportunity for us, and we're all immensely grateful for the invitation. Having said that, I feel fraudulent in kicking us off for two reasons. I know that we want to zero in on China, but I'm going to make you wait a little bit to get to China. And the reason for that is that it seems to me that we can't answer, or we can't even start posing the questions that Dr. Samir has just put to us without having a framework of ideas about the nature of the existing international system into which China is making such waves at the moment, that we need to have that framework first. And that's why I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about what I call the rise of the nation state and the impact of nationalism and the nationalization of the state on international politics more generally. And I shall get at the end towards some of the questions that one wants to ask about Asian nationalism and Chinese nationalism in particular, which I hope will form a way into the second lecture by my friend Stefan Halper. My second sort of qualification just in the beginning is to ask you to forgive me. You may be able to hear that I have a cold. I've tried to damp it down. My colleagues got used yesterday to the violent sneezing fits to which I am prone and which are somewhat uncontrollable. I hope they don't occur during my remarks this morning, but if they do, I shall have to ask you to indulge me. Right, let me have a go. The decline of the nation state has been repeatedly forecast from the beginning of the 20th century. But it has shown a remarkable resilience and still dominates the international political landscape well into the second decade of the 21st century. So I want to ask three questions. First, is there a difference between the state and the nation state? Secondly, what kind of international order flows from the primacy of the state? And thirdly, getting closer all the time to where we want to go, what differences to the state and to the international order were introduced by the rise of nationalism and the nationalization of the state? And I shall then conclude with a few remarks about how the future and how Asian nationalism in general and Chinese nationalism in particular may either reinforce or alter that framework. So the state and the nation state. The short answer to my first question is yes. There was a state before there was a nation state. And let me explain this by making 2 points. Firstly, traditional pre-national states belonged to their rulers. The people did not play an active part in politics, nor, for the most part, did they have any civil or political rights. And let me illustrate this point with an example drawn from Asia, but not from China. Let me illustrate it with reference to Japan. But the argument that I want to make, I think, would hold in most parts of the world. I choose Japan because most people think of Japan as a natural nation state. They are, after all, one people, one culture, one language. But until the centralization of the Japanese state in the early 17th century, Japan was organized into a series of competing and often warring clans. Even after the centralization of the state, the clans were not only required to pay tribute to the shogun's government in Edo, that's to say modern Tokyo, but they were required, the local barons, the daimyo, were required every other year to make a pilgrimage from their domains to Edo. And when they left, they were required to leave a hostage behind. Much of when the whole nationalized state was built after the 1860s, after the Meiji Restoration, there was a huge real estate boom because all of these hostages had built great houses all over Edo, and indeed one of the first private university in modern Tokyo, Keio, was built by a liberal runaway samurai who didn't want to be a samurai, he wanted to be an educator, and he saw an opportunity and bought one of these houses which was no longer required because you didn't have to leave hostages behind, and now it is the center of this university. So the point that I'm really making is that even after the pre-national state had been centralized, there was a constant fear of rebellion and no concept of a wider national solidarity amongst the people. It was only after the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s that the new imperial government set out quite deliberately and with spectacular success to modernize their society by creating a national state with centralized institutions of education, communication, defense, and so on. So it's quite a late development. First point. Second point, before the rise of modern centralized states, still not necessarily national states, many kinds of sovereign political units coexisted with each other and with others that were not sovereign or didn't have centralized institutions or power structures of any kind. The three most common were hereditary principalities or kingdoms, multi-ethnic and sometimes multi-religious dynastic empires, and city-states. My point in recalling this mixed political landscape, which survived well into the 20th century, is to contrast it with the present situation, or the present theoretical situation. In our world, there is meant to be only one kind of sovereignty. That's to say, popular sovereignty. And only one kind of state, the nation state. Even now, of course, this is all very well in theory, but it does not often correspond very closely with reality. The hereditary principle survives here and there, including here in the United Arab Emirates, although it is, of course, conjoined, as it wasn't in the pre-national era, with a system of citizenship and rights. But in at least one country in the modern international system, the state has collapsed altogether. It is a real irony of modern international politics that the one bit of Somalia, that is to say the Republic of Somaliland, which more or less functions, is not recognized by any country, whereas Somalia, which occupies the seat in all of the international organizations, only pays its civil servants with extreme difficulty and the aid of external largesse, and doesn't actually function as a state at all, even 20, 25 years after its first collapse. So just to do a reprise on my first question, is there a difference between the state and the nation state? My answer is that the state came first, followed after the American and French revolutions by the nation state. The nationalization of the state and of society started in the West, and that will have implications when we get to discuss how the Chinese view the world. It started in the West, but after 2 world wars, and as a result of decolonization, and I suppose one should say a long-term result of the industrial, agricultural and scientific revolutions, it spread worldwide. The characteristic of the nation state, the characteristics rather, are popular sovereignty, that's to say the proposition that ultimately the state belongs to the people, and the idea that each state should represent one people, one culture. In many ways, it is an impossible dream. The Japanese, who I mentioned a few moments ago, and we think of as a kind of paradigmatic nation state, one people, one culture, one thing, are in fact composed of, one Japanese professor once told me, 7 different groups. We're all mongrels, even though we like to pretend that we're not. But it may be an impossible dream, but it has been an enormously influential dream. So to move to my second question, what kind of international order did the rise of the centralized state lead to? And the short answer to that question is, of course, that it led to a competitive system based ultimately on war and stabilized to the extent that it ever was stabilized by the balancing of power. In amplification, let me make 3 points. Internally, the vast majority of traditional states were autocratic. Some were ruled well, others were ruled badly. But in very few was there a system of popular representation. Rulers had to worry about the support of powerful regional barons or clan leaders on whom they relied for revenue and or forces, and who might challenge their authority, but they didn't have to worry about the people. I say that, and of course it will become absolutely clear as we go on, that this whole schema that I'm talking about has its roots in Western history. I'm not sure that Ibn Khaldun would have agreed with what I have just said, because after all, he described a system in which, on a cyclical basis, periodically a dissident ruler from the member of the ruling class went out into the desert and raised the tribes, came back and sacked the city, and started the whole thing over again. So there were other models, but the point I'm making is that the dominant model, which has driven the organization of international relations for the last 300 years, derived from the rise of, not the nation state, but the rise of the West before the nation state. So this top-down system led to an international politics in which sovereign princes were preoccupied with each other and with their status. The cynical amongst you, that would, by the way, include my wife, would say, so what has changed? But I'm making the argument that quite a lot has actually changed. First point. Externally, in the system, pre-modern system, the sport of kings was war. They hunted wild animals at home and each other abroad. If you don't doubt that, go to any of the world's great museums and look at those incredible friezes from this part of the world, which show rulers relaxing with chariots and spears and beginning a tradition which goes on to this day. If you ever watch those nature programs about lions killing gazelles, killing the last and weakest gazelle. It's always presented as this marvelous natural chain. No one ever thinks about the gazelle who's having a really bad time as he gets pinned down. Well, it's the same on these friezes. The sport of kings was undoubtedly the hunt. And when the hunt wasn't available because you weren't in control, you turned on your neighbors. Empires rose and fell across the world, sometimes as the result of internal decay, but usually as the result of either conquest or the transfer of territory in marriage settlements or dowry payments. Remember, what the people thought about it didn't actually matter. In a really sort of cynical but amusing aside, my great guru, who was an expert on nationalism, Ernest Gellner, used to say that peasants don't need to speak, they only need to grunt. They didn't have a position on politics. They were the objects of politics, not the subjects of it. The potential for interstate war was constant, but was made much more dangerous in the Christian West from the 16th century by schism within the Church. The religious wars between the Protestant and Catholic churches of Europe led to a period of prolonged religious and ideological warfare. Now, this significance of this local sectarian conflict in the West for the rest of the world today is that when it ended in 1648, the peace treaty signed at Westphalia laid the foundations for the modern world order. It did so in two respects. The first was legal. The sovereignty of the princes was mutually guaranteed in that they were allowed to choose their own religion. And that principle, which was not new in 1648, was nonetheless encoded in the Peace of Westphalia, and I won't use the Latin, but it translated, roughly speaking, as to each prince his own religion. And its significance for us is that it is the ancestor clause, in legal terms, of Articles 2.4 and 2.7 of the United Nations Charter. That's to say, the clauses that make the price of international cooperation non-interference in the domestic affairs of other countries. The sovereign state, secondly, that was the legal implication, but the second respect that of significance was strategic and diplomatic, because the sovereign state that emerged was, of course, a self-help state. The fact that religious war had been outlawed did not mean no war. Indeed, the sovereigns could fight about anything else, and did. The result was a highly competitive system where such order as existed derived from the unstable balance between the major powers. Great thing about balances of power is that they always broke down. Critics of the dominant realism would say, what is this balance of power? I think it's one of those concepts that Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher, called nonsense on stilts. But the answer to that was that the famous English academic once made was that the alternative to the balance of power was a monopoly of power. And on the whole, because they were more of the major powers in Europe were large enough and more or less equal, but they preferred independence and this unstable balance to the idea of a universal empire. Another thought which has certain resonance when we come to think about China's different history and how it relates to the contemporary system. So to turn finally to my third question, what difference did nationalism and the nationalization of the state make? What difference did it make transferring ownership of the state from the ruler to the people? And I'm afraid there's no definite answer to that question, because in the famous saying, it depends on where you stand to ask it. From one angle, the impact seems to be neutral, making almost no difference. From another, it seems to be entirely positive. And from a third, it seems almost equally entirely negative. And I will begin to move towards the end by considering each of those in turn. First of all, if we take the view that nationalism and the nationalization of the state made no essential difference, the point, I suppose, that I'm making is that there's a great deal of continuity in international politics between the pre-national era and the modern world. We still live in a world of states that are both jealous of their independence and highly competitive. These days, they're perhaps more likely to compete over market share or energy contracts or the way a pipeline will run and what borders it will cross than over territory for its own sake, as they often did in the past. Although in some parts of the world, and this is something I think we will want to consider, in some parts of the world, Kashmir, Taiwan, the Golan Heights, territory remains the ultimate prize. And it's quite interesting to know whether that's purely because mankind is sort of an anachronistic animal. It can't catch up with what's happening, or whether actually territory still is the ultimate prize. I mean, one of the really extraordinary things about international politics, despite all the interdependence, despite globalization, is the territorial imperative. When Kenya became independent, the British, who had been the colonial power, had tried to solve a problem in advance by moving what is now the northeastern province of Kenya into Somalia, because it was largely part of the nomadic pasture lands, or the lands used by nomads for pasturing at different times of the year from Somalia. And Tom Mboya, the first foreign minister of Kenya, who was later assassinated, said the Somalis can exercise their right of self-determination any time they like. All they have to do is walk across the frontier into Somalia. This was despite the fact that the people who actually lived in this place were Somalis. So there is something extraordinarily obdurate about territory, and people are very reluctant to let it go, even when it would make sense of letting it go. And that is worldwide. it's as true of the Hungarian-speaking bit between Slovakia and Hungary as it is, it is, as I say, just to use that example, of the northeastern province of Kenya. When we come to look at China, its view on territory is very distinctive. And this is causing, as China tries to integrate into the modern system, both by joining all its the multilateral organizations and so on, it's not unique, as I hope I've just suggested. It's not at all unique in not wanting to make any concessions on territorial questions, but it does adopt a position of complete non-negotiability on any major territorial claim. And of course, much of its problems in the international system at the moment stem from its land disputes with India, which I'll say something about in another lecture, in Aksai Chin and in Leh and on the edge of Tibet, Arunachal Pradesh, but also, of course, in the South and East China Seas, and which Stefan will be talking about. So such order that was maintained is underwritten by the great powers, supported by a network of multilateral institutions which were created after 1945, although one might say that since the end of the Cold War, this never very stable order has been unbalanced further, partly because of the dominance of a single superpower, and now by the emergence of a power whose understanding of the international system appears to be rather different from the sketch and framework that I've just outlined. So that's the view of the impact of nationalism and nationalization, which takes a neutral or no change view. What about those who say, nonsense, nationalism is progressive? Because, of course, nationalism everywhere starts as a movement to liberate people and to improve their welfare in terms of health, education, and material standards of living. After each major 20th century catastrophe, an attempt was made to align the international order with this progressive national vision. After 1918, the world map was to be redrawn according to the principles of national self-determination, democracy, and collective security. After 1945, institutions were created to support an open economy by allowing developed countries to pursue full employment policies and developing countries to diversify and modernize their economies. After 1989, the world order was to be democratized with guarantees of universal human rights and the rule of law. None of these schemes was particularly successful, although the vision remains extremely attractive. I need to qualify that in a minute, but it does remain extremely attractive. And underpinning its attraction, I think, is the idea, which some people, I'm not sure, I wouldn't argue against it, but the idea that a national, democratic, and prosperous world will also be peaceful. The broader qualification that I would make relates to what happened after 1989. Because I think the idea of a world made safe for national self-determination after the First World War was extremely popular, even when the major powers of the day didn't want to extend it beyond Europe. The idea of having institutions which could facilitate development, even if they didn't often facilitate development, after 1945 was extremely popular. The idea that there was one interpretation of human rights, good governance, and so on. All of the reforms which were sort of put together in the phrase the Washington Consensus. That idea was very popular in Europe, very popular in North America, and much less popular everywhere else. In 1993, there was...
Scan has completed. Warning. Advanced Mac Cleaner has detected issues that need your immediate attention.
Please stop everything. Stop everything. So, sorry for...
Not at all. It's...
Please.
Can I go on?
Yes.
If I can't remember what I was saying.
1993.
Yeah, 1993. Thank you very much. Very good cue person. There was a huge conference in Vienna, which on the anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, that document, of course, when it was signed, it was already the Cold War, it wasn't signed by everyone. The Soviets didn't sign it, some of their satellites didn't sign it. Now, and by 1993, I think I'm right in saying everybody had signed and ratified it. So you would have thought this was a sort of a moment of celebration. But in fact, that conference was used as the platform for an attack on the West and this vision of a new world order, mounted not just by China, although China was one of the countries that mounted it, but by China, India, and Singapore. And their argument was that this post-1989 collapse of communism had given rise to an unwarranted triumphalism, and that the West was attempting to bulldoze a new form of cultural imperialism across the world. Now, this is a very difficult issue because there were, as in all modern multilateral conferences, there were something like 600 Asian non-governmental organizations represented in Vienna. And they gave, as all such organizations always do in these occasions, they gave numerous press conferences saying, don't listen to them. Don't listen to the Chinese government. Don't listen to the Indian government. Don't listen to the Singapore government. They would say that, wouldn't they? They're just a lot of autocrats wanting to shore up their own position. Now, there are no Asian values. There are just values. Human rights inhere in our humanity. That's the argument, which is what people had signed up to. But one doesn't actually know who to believe in this case, because the 600 NGOs were not on the whole talking back to their countries. They were beaming what they had to say into Berlin, New York, Washington, London, Paris, and so on. So they had an audience which was not necessarily their own audience. So it doesn't actually, either way, it leaves one with an enigma, not knowing quite where one stands on this. And it's still certainly the case. I mean, I have one final point to drive this home. If you looked at what happened after the first Gulf War, the war in which there was a wider degree of international consensus than on any other occasion, with not only all 5 permanent members of the Security Council voting in favor, but massive regional support with the ironic exception of Jordan. And then there was the ceasefire. Then there was Saddam Hussein had been left with enough firepower to bear down on the Kurds, and the question came, what was to be done about that? And it was done, but it was done without be worse. I don't know if any fans of American music can have perverse as well as positive consequences. And these have contributed to many contemporary conflicts. The fundamental reason, perhaps, is that defending the nation state and its territory becomes a sacred patriotic duty. One can illustrate this if you think of the continuing row that goes on about the Turkish positional good. Only one person, one lot of people could occupy that territory at a time. And then you begin to get the problems that would go along with that. Where the majority had little or no say in politics, it didn't matter so much who ruled the territory, and it could be moved, and indeed was moved around. After the rise of the nation state, this was no longer possible. There were also particular problems that arose from each part of the progressive international order that I sketched following the catastrophes of the 20th century. After 1918, the principle of national self-determination raised the troubling question of who were the people and what was to happen to minorities. A problem that still rankles right across the international system, including in China. After 1945, the argument about how to organize the modern economy to maximize welfare for all fed into the ideological struggle for the Cold War. And one might say that that, after all, was won by the West, even if by default. But it was by default. I mean, it was won by the West at a time when electoral enthusiasm for the Western political system was at an all-time low. So it was hardly a triumph of spirited enthusiasm for the Western political system. After 1989, the attempt to make democracy the basis of the New World Order, rather than leaving it as the constitutional arrangement favored by some but not all states, helped to repoliticize religion in this part of the world but actually in many other parts of the world as well, and led to new patterns of intervention by the strong in the affairs of the weak. And so that's really, I suppose the general point that I've tried to get across is that that's the rather ambiguous framework of international politics within which we have to assess new and major geopolitical changes. And just let me finish by making two points about Asian nationalism and the international order that I've tried to describe. Quite quickly, although after the Second World War, a principle got established in international diplomacy and international law for handling the problem of the creation of new states. It was actually imported into Africa from Latin America, where it had been used in the 19th century. And it was the principle they call uti possidetis. Roughly speaking, that you hang on to what you've got at the time of independence. And this was to deal with this question that nationalism poses: who are the people? You know, it's rumbled right the way through the nationalist discussion. He eventually became the British judge on the World Court, a man called Ivor Jennings. And he once said, when Woodrow Wilson first introduced the idea of national self-determination, the question was, who were the people? And the answer was, let the people decide. Let's have a plebiscite. And he said, it sounded brilliant, let the people decide, but it was in fact absurd, because how could the people decide until someone decided who were the people? So you've got this, there's no available objective criteria for who a people who has this right is, and who a minority who thinks they should have the right. When it shouldn't have done, East Timor, and it was the Asian financial crisis that it was forced to give it up. India, which took the moral high ground on every possible occasion in the post-1945 world, nonetheless after Hyderabad had opted to join Pakistan, and there were one or two other small places. It did the same with Goa, and when the saint, who was much honoured in Goa, was brought out to try and preserve the Catholic identity of Goa, and the public frenzy was such that the saint lost a toe and has never been brought out again. And the demographics of Goa changed over time, which is what happened from 60% Catholics, 40% Hindus, to 60% Hindus, 40%, probably not, because there's a Muslim population as well, not the other way around. Pakistan would not accept the ruling by the Maharaja to opt for India and infiltrated people into Kashmir, which has led to the longest lasting dispute in which the United Nations has been absorbed in Kashmir. China, of course, absorbed Tibet by force in 1951, leading to the exile of the Dalai Lama in 1959, and so on. So it took the Asian countries, they wanted to tidy the map up, and on the whole they wanted to tidy it up by reference to ancient arguments or racial arguments. That's my first point. So they fell in line. Well, no, the Chinese haven't. That's what they've done. They're going to keep going there. They haven't quite made it. But the others, more or less. The second point is more speculative, but I think it's something which we ought to consider over the next 2 or 3 days. And that is what happens to the world order as power shifts from west to east. Now, the point I'm making is not a point about the decline of the United States or even about the rise of China. Because whether China will continue to rise, and we shall hear later that there's very considerable doubt about that, whether it will continue to rise at the sort of exponential rate that it has done in recent years, it is already a very significant international player, whether one likes it or not. And the point is that it had absolutely nothing to do with the drafting, if you like, the framing of the Westphalian order and the modern system of international law and the modern system of diplomacy. It likes quite a lot of it, wants to cherry pick quite a lot of it, but it wasn't in at the creation, as it were. And that must, one suspects, make a difference. Now, I would offer you a proposition, which is that in any international system, at any time in history, it is the great powers, no one country makes the international order completely. But in any system, it is the great powers who shape it more than they are shaped by it. It's an asymmetric. They are influenced by it, but they're not driven by it. They do more of the driving. And if you allow that the Western monopoly on the basic ideas of international politics, which have dominated since the middle of the 17th century, are now will be challenged. How will they be challenged? What will the new configuration of ideas for running an international system look like? And it seems to me that there are only really 3 options on answering that question. One is that you'll have the same old game but new players. And this does suggest that the balance of power will tilt, that even if it isn't declining now, at some point in the future, the West will decline relative to the East, and that you'll get the same game marked by rivalries, instability, realpolitik, but new players. The other view is that second view is that you'll get a new game with entirely new rules. And you'll get a new game because the system that I've described and that we've grown up with and inherited came out of, in the last analysis, European history, modified by the impact of Europe's encounter elsewhere in the world. But the civilizations of the East have different traditions. In Europe, there were a whole lot of rather powerful, more or less equal in size, states who weren't going to surrender their independence. China was always hugely dominant in its area. India is more complicated because only the Mughals got some way towards uniting it, and then the British. And it's always been no. But one thing you can say about both civilizations, I think, is that compared with the Atlantic seaboard, foggy little islands like Britain or Portugal on the end of a peninsula, who, if they were to make an impact on the world, had to go outwards. Whereas the Chinese and the Indians, the Indians were always being invaded over the Himalaya. And the Chinese had all these people sweeping in from Central Asia. They took on essentially, they wanted to keep the world out. So they build walls, they hide behind the Himalaya or whatever it may be. So one doesn't know whether the sort of deep down values are the same or are quite different. And they don't help us much on that. You can read the literature, and mostly they raise the question and then quickly get back to talking about the existing system. So we don't get a real view of how it's... the most likely, I suppose, is that it'll be some sort of hybrid between these two, and it's... who was it? Was it Chow Enlai who said about the French Revolution and its impact, it's too early to say. Oh, it is really too early to know what the outcome of this question that I'm talking will be. I think there is another, though, very difficult conundrum, and I'll leave this with you. And you've only got to go through that window and drive. This is my first visit to Dubai, and it took my breath away yesterday. But it raises in one's mind the problem which applies to the rise to great power status of India and China, and that is it's built on modernization, what we call modernization. And it isn't clear, at least it's not clear to me, and I will be very interested in views from around the floor, on whether the values that drive modernization are only contingently, accidentally Western, but are sort of built into the process of modernization. Or whether you can have whether it would be possible to have, I don't know, a modernized Confucian view of modernization. That seems to me a very big question, which will become clear, I suppose, as time goes on, but which we ought to at least recognize as a question to ask. Sorry if I've gone on too long, but thank you very much.